of all, the reason why we have him here with us tonight is he is the Mellon Fellow at the Huntington Library for the 2019-2020 academic year. He is currently completing research and revisions for his book manuscript, Freedom's Generation, Coming of Age in the Era of Emancipation. This project traces the lives of the generation of Black and white children in the North, South, and West who grew up during the Civil War era, exploring how young people across the nation learned about and experienced emancipation. Dr. Davidson, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you, Janet, for the nice introduction. It's great to be with you all virtually. I know this is a strange format. This is actually my first Zoom lecture also, so we'll see how it goes, but I'm excited to share some of my research with you, and I'm excited to hear your questions. So what I'm going to do is talk for about half an hour, maybe a little bit more, and share some of the exciting things that I've found in my research and what I'm doing with my book project. And then I'd love to hear any questions that you have about any aspect of my research you might be interested in. So as Janet mentioned, this year I've been very lucky to be the Mellon Fellow at the Huntington Library. And I'm just sharing my PowerPoint here. Oops. There we go. So as I was saying, I've been very lucky to be a fellow at the Huntington Library this year for it was meant to be September to May. Unfortunately, it's been closed for the past couple of months. But I found a lot of great materials there, and I've made some good progress on my book project. Last year, I was a fellow at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., where I also did research and worked on some exhibitions and public history work there. And as Janet mentioned, I finished my PhD at NYU in 2018. So I've been interested in the Civil War and questions of slavery and emancipation for a long time. But I didn't necessarily come to college expecting to major in history. I actually didn't really like history in high school all that much. But I took a class in college on slavery, and working with those kind of primary documents really just got me excited about this formative experience in the middle of the 19th century when the nation is transformed by the Civil War. And I've really just been thinking about it ever since. So my current book project, which is based on my dissertation, I'm working on revising the dissertation into a book now, is called Freedom's Generation, Coming of Age in the Era of Emancipation. So this book explores the lives of young people who grew up during the Civil War. So I look at Black and white children in the North, South, and West, born between about 1847 and 1862. So they would have been young enough to have experienced the war as children, but old enough to likely have some sort of memory of the conflict. And I use children's diaries, letters of parents, school textbooks, toys and games, photographs, art, anything that I can really find that will help me to reconstruct what young people's experiences were like during the American Civil War. So the kind of central questions of this project are: what did it mean to be part of the first generation to come of age in the US after slavery? And following from that, I try to argue that children played a more active role in shaping the meanings of emancipation than we've really given them credit for up until this point. So children constituted actually, people under 19 and under constituted more than half of the population in the United States in 1860, which is a higher percentage than it has ever been since. So I think that we really, although there's been important work on young people in the Civil War, we've really not fully explored the role that they played in this transformative moment in American history. The other thing that I explore with this project is the question of what young people's experiences, lives, and actions tell us about the meanings of freedom as they unfolded after slavery ended. So in this project, I argue that young people's lives help us to understand that ideas of freedom existed on a spectrum. So this spectrum ranged from people who thought that African Americans shouldn't have access to the same political freedoms as other people, and the spectrum on the other end involved ideas mainly held by African American women and children that freedom was made in everyday life and had to be based on contextual circumstances. So these ideas were carried forward by various groups and sort of shaped the politics of the US many years after the Civil War ended. So as I said, what I want to do today is really think about some of the most exciting things that I found in my research, rather than sort of give you a complete overview of the project or dwell on kind of the minutia of a particular aspect of it. I just want to give some examples of the best documents, photographs, and stories that I've found, and there are many more than the ones that I'll share today. But I just wanted to give you some of the examples that help us understand how children played a more active role in the Civil War than we've previously understood. And if there's anything that kind of catches your eye, please feel free to ask more questions. So this first document that I have here is a petition written by a group of children in Concord, Massachusetts, to Abraham Lincoln, asking him to free all slave children. So this was 1864. So these children understand, or of course they were taught, that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all enslaved children. It only freed children in territories in rebellion. So these children have been taught about slavery. They've been taught about how slavery affects young people in particular, and they've related that to their own experiences, and they've taken direct action to reshape the meanings of the Civil War. This would be interesting and important on its own, but we actually know that Lincoln received this petition and he responded to it. So the name Mary Mann was written on this petition. She was the wife of Horace Mann, the educational reformer. And Abraham Lincoln writes back to Mary Mann, and he asked her to tell the children that while he can't do it immediately, it seems that God wills that this war will result in slavery ending. So this is really a great example of sorry, the slideshow just cut out. There we go. This is a great example of the ways that young people participated in shaping the meanings of the Civil War, how they took direct action to change the course of the conflict, and how their direct actions reached the highest levels of politics. And these young people would carry these actions forward into their later lives. So my project really has two halves. The first half explores young people's experiences of the conflict, how they engaged with questions of slavery, how they forced the end of slavery to occur sooner. And the second half of the project looks at memory. So when these young people became adults, how did they use their memories of the Civil War and their memories of childhood specifically to think about their politics in the 1880s, 1890s, and further on into the 20th century. So this document really is a great starting point for the project, for thinking about how children learned from the abolitionist literature they were reading, how they learned from the adults around them, and how they sought to participate in the most important aspects of the conflict. So one of the really exciting things about the Civil War is the huge expansion of photography and how images started to circulate in a new way. And children do find themselves in these images of war. So here we can see a group of children. It looks like two girls are having a picnic, and you see two boys dressed in uniform observing a Union cavalry. So initially, this image tells a story of children likely posed, the photographer trying to sort of create a contrast between everyday life and the lives of children. But this photograph also tells a larger story. It tells us about how children were never far from the devastation of the conflict. It helps us to imagine how the traumas of war were not far away from the conflict. And it also tells us how, again, children took an active role in making sense of the war for themselves. They put on these uniforms and they played games of war. We don't know the exact games that these specific children played in this photograph, but we do have other examples of diaries and letters that tell us about children playing with toy soldiers, often made out of paper. Diaries and letters telling us about children, young boys especially, who wished they could go to war even though they were not old enough. And there are numerous other ways that young people engaged in the war in direct ways, and again carried these experiences forward to their adult lives. Of course, this experience was most visceral for children in the South, for example, in this photograph in Virginia. And there's a diary by a young woman, Carrie Berry, who keeps a record of her experiences in Atlanta, and she writes about the real trauma of Sherman coming through Atlanta and feeling like this has kind of destroyed her childhood. And you see that reflected in memoirs later on, and this sense that for this generation of Southerners, but white Southerners, but people across the nation as well, this really transformed their worlds, was often traumatic, and played a dramatic role in shaping the politics of the rest of the 19th century and after. And we really can't understand that aftermath of the war without thinking about young people. So of course the war was most deeply meaningful for African Americans who became free. And this experience of becoming free was often understood in the context of family. So here in this photograph in Virginia, we can see a group of, as they were called at the time, contraband of war, a group of African American men, women, and children who became free during the conflict. And I like this photograph because it helps us think about freedom as a generational process. These young people were learning the meanings of freedom from their parents, and they were also having the opportunity to attend school for the first time. So one of the organizations that was creating schools for freed people was the American Missionary Association.
Yeah, I can't get in on the computer, so just get the audio on the phone. I don't know.
A little bit of background. One of the types of schools that they were attending was the American Missionary Association School. And the amazing thing about that is that we have the letters written by a number of these teachers. And these teachers often write about how capable the students are, but they also write about what freedom meant for young people who were experiencing freedom for the first time during the Civil War. So almost always this question of freedom is understood in the context of family. So especially for young people who were enslaved in the Upper South, in Virginia, North Carolina, for example, one of the most common experiences of slavery was having a family member or a friend sold further south. So in these letters, the white teacher, most of the time, white teachers are talking about how young people experience freedom in terms of searching for family. And this experience is carried forward. These young people who become free during the Civil War search for their families throughout their lives. There are newspaper notices posted as late as 1920 of people who became free during the Civil War, writing, for example, my brother was sold away from Virginia to Louisiana. Has anyone heard of this person? And this notice was posted in a black newspaper as late as 1920. So we can think about how this young person had that experience as a child, and it shaped their lives long after the Civil War ended. So children, as I've tried to explore with these two examples, were important actors in shaping meanings of freedom. They pushed their parents to think about the war in particular ways, and they pushed the freedom onto the agenda for people who may not have been thinking of it. But freedom was also, or children also operated as symbols. So this is one of the most famous paintings from the American South in the Civil War era. It's called the Burial of Latinae. So this photograph hung in many Southern homes after the Civil War, and you can see that they're mourning a Confederate soldier, and right above the coffin is a young white Southern girl. And this, we can kind of reflect on what this girl's experiences might have been like at the time, but it's also important to think about how this image of how this girl represented the white South as a whole. She was used to represent the kind of innocence of the South, and later on, especially white Southern women would reflect back on their childhoods growing up during the war, and use the symbolic nature of their childhood to argue for a vision of the Confederacy, a more positive vision of the Confederacy that was circulating in the culture at large. So children were used as symbols in many other ways as well. In parades celebrating emancipation, often the leading columns were a group of African-American children. And in the North as well, children attended reunions dressed as soldiers and stood in for the idea that the North had sacrificed to preserve the Union for the next generation. So this is another thing that I think about in the project as well, the question of children as symbols. So beyond children as actors and children as symbols, it's also fun to think about what young people played with during the war, what sort of games and toys they played with. So this is one of the most famous examples of a game from the Civil War era. So this is called the Myriacticon. It's one of the most famous Milton Bradley games. And the way this game works is children were given a lecture about the Civil War, and they were meant to read it as they turn the images that are on a scroll. So there are about 12 images, and I've captured one here. This is an image of freed people during the Civil War, taken from a photograph, and children were instructed to tell the story of the war being about emancipation. So in the immediate aftermath of the war, it's important to think about how white Northern parents wanted to instruct their children about the war as involving emancipation, and how this narrative may have disappeared over time. There were other games that children played. For example, there was a group of Uncle Tom's Cabin playing cards, and then young people read stories about the Civil War. So they read stories about drummer boys, they read stories about freed people coming north. And these stories helped to kind of instruct them in how the war could be about freedom. So another aspect of the war, of course, is child soldiers. So officially, young people could not join the conflict until they were about 18 years of age for the Union Army and 16 in the Confederacy. These ages sort of stopped being enforced and started falling over time. And young people could join at the age of 14 as musicians. But at least at the start of the conflict, the two sides tried to enforce age barriers, which is why I've generally still thought of children younger than 18 who joined as children. So one child who I read about is someone who becomes Captain Luis Emilio. He's only 15 when he joins early in the conflict. And in this photograph, he has become an officer for the Massachusetts 54th, most famous Black regiment. And the war is obviously deeply meaningful, and I argue it's especially meaningful because he experiences it as such a young man. Throughout his life, his main sort of occupation and hobby is to preserve the memory of the Massachusetts 54th through public commemorations, through published books, and I really think that his sort of childhood experiences of growing up during the conflict shape his investment in preserving those memories. In the Massachusetts 54th, there were also a number of young African-American children who served as musicians. One young man here, Henry Monroe, is involved in the battle at Fort Wagner at only the age of 13. So he is a drummer boy at this incredibly violent conflict at a young age. And we can really see how young he is here. Another young man, Alexander Johnston, also serves as a musician in the Massachusetts 54th. So I think it's really important to think about how the experience of the war meant different things depending on how old one was. And there were as many as, there were hundreds of thousands of people under the age of 18 who fought in the Civil War. And as they carry their experiences forward, it's really powerful to think about how their politics for the rest of their lives were understood through the lens of the Civil War. Thinking about another African-American man who experienced growing up during the Civil War, Jacob Stroyer, is actually impressed to work for the Confederates at Fort Moultrie. And he witnesses emancipation during Fort Sumter. So he writes a number of memoirs in the 1880s and 1890s. And in each successive memoir, he writes more and more about emancipation. So it's important to think about the context in which these young people eventually wrote about their memories. So in the 1880s and 1890s, as there's increasing violence against African Americans in the South, Stroyer sees this and he wants to write about more and more about emancipation because he wants to make sure that people are remembering this memory of the conflict. And he has really sort of evocative recollections about that first day of seeing the federal flag raised at Fort Sumter again. On the other side of things, young people who grew up in the Confederacy developed an entire industry involved with remembering their childhoods. People talk a lot about the lost cause or the creation of a memory about the Confederacy that argues that they're sort of the reasons for why they fought the war have been misunderstood. And I think people haven't understood enough that a lot of the people creating these arguments of the lost cause had in fact been children themselves. So Mildred Rutherford becomes the historian of the Daughters of the Confederacy. She's born in 1851 in Georgia, and she kind of uses her childhood experiences to argue for a vision of an idyllic South. And she writes textbooks, she writes pamphlets, she writes books, and these are incredibly popular in the 1900s, the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And it's the weight of her experience as a child that lends power to what she's saying. So there are a lot of other famous Southerners who become part of this narrative as well. Thomas Nelson Page and Joel Chandler Harris are the most sort of famous writers of the plantation school who create a vision of the Old South, sort of moonlight and magnolia vision that we talk about today. And they both had been children during the Civil War and talk about that formative experience of growing up during the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson is also a Civil War child, and he becomes the first Southern president elected since the Civil War early on in the 20th century. And I think that that's a really important moment as well. And it's important to think about these well-known people along with the kind of everyday people that I've talked about. Other important examples are Teddy Roosevelt, who talks about, some people talk about him witnessing Lincoln's funeral train passing through New York. And then Booker T. Washington, perhaps the most famous African-American man who grew up during the Civil War. And in Up From Slavery, his well-known memoir, he talks about how becoming free and learning what freedom meant shaped the decisions that he made later on in life. So in this project overall, I explore how this generation actually played a much more important role in shaping the United States than we've previously given them credit for. So I follow my actors into the 1930s. One project that occurs in the 1930s is the Works Project Administration. And one of the things they do is employ interviewers to go into the South and interview the last surviving people who had been enslaved. And so one person, the elderly woman depicted here, had been enslaved. And the Works Progress Administration interviews with more than 3,000 formerly enslaved people. It is one of the best sources that we have for telling us about slavery. But since it was the 1930s, most of these people had experienced slavery as children. And actually, as much as slavery itself, the most formative experience that they had as children was of the Civil War. So in almost every single interview, the Civil War is the dominant theme. And this really tells us about how young people who grew up during the Civil War fought to preserve their understandings of the conflict throughout their lives, and how they were an important generation who played a role in the politics of the United States by using their memories of the Civil War and of emancipation to fight for particular visions of the nation. So what I've been doing this year in working to revise my book project is to sort of add some new stories from the Huntington Library. So I'll just mention two of them, and of course I'm happy to answer any more questions about those later on. So one is the Huntington Library holds the papers of George Patton, who is the father of the World War II General George Patton. So my George Patton is born in about 1856, and he is born in Virginia. He grows up in Virginia during the Civil War, and he experiences the conflict and the violence of the war in Virginia, and he actually loses his father later on in the conflict. And his mother decides, as a result of this traumatic experience, to take George and the rest of his family to California, Southern California. And eventually they arrive in San Marino, where when George becomes an adult, he works for Henry Huntington. So in his papers, George Patton, we have his letters from when he's a teenager in the 1860s. And he writes about being a Confederate child or young person in California. And he writes about how he refuses to sing the national anthem in his school because he's mad at his teacher for being a Yankee. So it's interesting to reflect on how young people carried their political beliefs, first of all, how they developed their political beliefs, but how they carried their political beliefs forward into their teenage years, into their adulthood, whether they remained in the North or South, or whether they moved elsewhere in the nation. Another source that I've looked at is the Diary of Samuel Armstrong. So Samuel Armstrong is a Union soldier, also like Luis Emilio, who I talked about earlier, joins the Army at the age of 15. And as he's fighting in Virginia, he writes in his diary, the Confederates particularly give his regiment a hard time because they have accepted runaway slaves into their ranks. So he feels they're a target of particular attacks because of that. But the most sort of powerful experience for him is actually witnessing going into a hospital tent, and there he sees the body of an African-American child who has been killed. And the doctor working in this hospital tells him that the boy was killed by his master for celebrating the Union. So we can really reflect on that experience of how Samuel Armstrong came to understand the meaning of freedom through the violence of the war. And it can return us again to the African American students and young people who we saw in an earlier photograph, and think about how this war was a transformative moment where they could celebrate in new ways, where they could attend school for the first time, but they were still young people who were vulnerable to the incredible violence that young person experienced, but also to uncertainty, not knowing where their family would move next, and to not knowing what opportunities lay ahead. And as all this unfolded for young people, they had to work out what freedom meant. And exploring that process with these young people, I think is a really important process for us, so that we can reflect on what the Civil War meant and what emancipation meant. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Those are some of the interesting sources that I've found, and some of the dynamics of my projects. I love to talk about it more and to explore anything that everyone's interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions in the chat window there for you, Dr. Davidson. I'm going to turn the cameras back on, and if people want to be able to ask you questions directly, they can do that as well.
Okay. I'll just scroll up and read the questions. Sure. So I'll just start with the questions in order. So the first question from Mike Cowan was all of this material found at the Huntington Library? I think I've gone to archives in 13 states, and I've found the material all over the place, and some of it's online, some of it's published. But as I was just talking about at the end of the presentation, there's incredible stuff at the Huntington Library. That just sort of is the tip of the iceberg. Those sources. They have a great collection of children's literature. Another really exciting collection that I looked at was a group of letters written to a Union soldier from schoolgirls in Wisconsin who organized a letter writing campaign to Union soldiers, and sort of reading them, asking him questions about, what was it like to encounter a Confederate? And they almost wrote about Confederates as if they were, people from a different species, or people from a different country, which they very much were. And those kind of sources really give a lot of insight. And any surprising finds? I think one of the things that's surprising is actually just how much children appear in photographs. So I think, at least for me, what came to mind first when I thought about Civil War photographs were battlefield photographs. But children often appear in staged next to battlefields, like they did in the one photograph I depicted. Children are everywhere in images of African Americans taken by Civil War photographers. And also, of course, carte de visite and other images that were passed among families. That was just such an important way that families connected with each other when they would be separated. Of course, there are famous stories of dead soldiers being found clutching images of their children, and that really helps me to kind of think about the meaning of family. Mike Cowan also asked, when will the book be published? That's a good question. I'd say hopefully in about 2 years. I still have a lot of work to do to kind of incorporate all the research that I did at the Huntington this year, but I will be very happy to have it as a book someday.
So if other people have questions, you can post them in the chat window, or you can unmute yourself and just use your audio locally if you'd like to do that as well. And I have turned on the ability for you to be able to share your camera. So if you'd like to be able to speak to Dr. Davidson directly, and Dr. Davidson, if you want to share your camera so people can see you again, you're welcome to do that as well.
Yeah, forgot it was off.
I just turned it off while you were presenting so that we can get some distracting notes on there.
Sounds good.
Dead air. Shit, this is terrible. I don't eat this shit. That's pizza here.
So, Dr. Davidson, I had a question for you on here. The images that you're showing on there, particularly like the ones from the post-era on there for those were obviously they were source images because they were, they were source references because there were people that had lived through that particular time.
Right.
But did you find that their views had changed for the ones that had spoken in the 20s and 30s versus ones that were more contemporary and what they had experienced during the war? Was there a difference or a balance there in any way?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, so it's interesting to trace people's views over time. One thing that's hard about that is
rainbows.
that a lot of times you don't have sources from the same people, so you might have stuff that somebody wrote in 1860, but not as much in 1920, or you might have someone who wrote a memoir in 1920, but you can't find anything that they wrote in 1860. So sometimes it's hard to piece together change over time. But when you do, I think the most common thing that you find is someone's belief only becomes stronger. So if someone was kind of rabid Confederate as a child, they would be entrenched in that belief as an adult. Or if someone had this very formative experience of becoming free during the war, they wanted to really make sure that other people understood how important that experience was. So for the people who did write about their experiences in the 1860s, they were, I would say, more likely to emphasize those beliefs later on.
Actually, what I was thinking about was, did the just general view change over time? Not maybe a specific person, but did you find that there was, like with the onset of the belief in the rise of the lost cause and that type of thing, did you see a difference in the changes as you were talking about, like with the Milton Bradley games right at the end of the war through what happened in the Reconstruction, and then into the 20s and 30s as the last of them had passed away?
Absolutely. Yeah, so in the mid-1860s, in the immediate aftermath of the war, emancipation as an important result of the war is a prominent story in children's literature, in textbooks, in newspapers, in popular culture. And even by 1880, it's mostly been erased from the most popular textbooks. So it's actually a very quick process in which that important meaning of the war is less common. And you only see that kind of persist over time. You see the rise of the lost cause. And the 1910s and 20s and 30s is really the height of that. Of course, you can, Gone with the Wind, that's published right around the end of the lives of this generation. Margaret Mitchell is born after Reconstruction, but she would have heard these stories, and she's kind of publishing that at the end of this generation's lives.
Camera.
You do have another question in the chat window.
Oh yeah. Janet asked, what is your next phase after leaving the Huntington? So I'm actually going to be visiting professor at a place called St. Michael's College in Vermont. So I'll be there for the next 2 years, and I'll be teaching classes in U.S. history and the humanities, and trying to finish my book.
Dr. Davidson, I don't know if you can hear me or not, can you?
Yes.
Okay, my question is, back in regards to the captain that you found that became, he became the captain of the Massachusetts regiment.
Yep.
How did he achieve that rank at such a young age?
I mean, a big part of it was that it was a black regiment, and a lot of white officers didn't want to join, didn't want to lead a black regiment. So it made it more likely that he would become an officer in that context. Of course, Robert Gould Shaw, you know, he became famous for serving as an officer. It was an enormous honor. But I think that played a role in him achieving that rank.
Well, I know, I mean, with a full regiment of black soldiers, it's hard to imagine, well, in today's world, that the other black soldiers would start respecting him enough for him to be the leader.
Right. I haven't, he doesn't say that in his recollections as far as I've seen, but that is certainly possible. But there just wasn't another option. There were no black officers at the time. So, you know, the African American soldiers in that regiment, they focused on the, you know, achieving their freedom through service in this way that did not feel possible a year earlier.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Good luck with your book.
Thank you.
So another question in the chat window.
I don't see it yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. They just sent it to me directly, so I'll read it to you.
Okay.
So this is from John. Are there any groups in which children had significantly different views of emancipation than their parents?
Well, among some African Americans in the generation that I talk about, people who were children during the war, there's sort of two directions that it can go. So the parents, the people who were adults who became free during the war, they really feel that it is, you know, this is a moment they've dreamed for their whole lives. But for people who are very young and who, as they start to, more and more of their life starts to be in freedom, some of them want to kind of forget the days of slavery, and they turn away from memorializing the war. So that's kind of an interesting intergenerational dynamic. So there are some African American leaders who were young, very young children during the war, who later on in the 19th century start to think about how it's better to look toward the future. And Booker T. Washington is sort of an example of that. He only has one chapter in his memoir about the Civil War, and it really is more about freedom than it is about slavery. And that's kind of the divide between those two generations of African Americans. The parents' generation wants to think about both slavery, the kind of pain of slavery, and the triumph of emancipation. And the younger generation often want to think about only the joy of emancipation, or kind of think about the future instead. And then you do sometimes have white Southerners who turn away from the kind of most racist versions of pro-Confederate thought. And you have white Southerners who grew up during the war and sort of say, like, you know, oh, I was a Confederate, but I have come to understand that ending slavery was a good thing. So you do see that in this generation. And I think that in part that is a result of, you know, seeing slavery end and seeing that not everything collapsed, although, you know, some people do interpret it that way.
I have a question for you in regards to that. I was just thinking about what you were saying about them generationally as some of that is changing. Where we are right now is about the equivalent of those that had grown up during World War II. Have you given any thought or consideration? Because I mean, I hear some of those same type of things for those that had grown up during that, particularly those that had grown up in Europe and Germany, of some of that contrast. they want to look forward, they don't want to look back, they want to be able to see things in a different way than their folks did. I was wondering if you'd given any thoughts to that. I realize it's a different war than what we're focused on, but I thought just as the time frame may be an interesting sort of coincidence as far as time here.
Yeah, I think there's an important comparison to be made, and especially thinking about this generation, the very last ones kind of alive at the end of the 1930s, and how that they were kind of telling their stories as this, most likely their grandchildren were going off to war, and thinking about how ideas of war and trauma were passed from one generation to the next, but also just thinking about comparing the two experiences is really interesting. The first thing that comes to mind is just letters home from fathers, and I think that the distance in the context of World War II kind of shaped that experience in interesting ways, but in both cases, the feeling that fathers had to shape their young children's lives and instruct them in the right ways to behave, even though they were far away, and young people feeling a sense of responsibility as a result of that. I think that that's a good comparison. Does that kind of get at what you were?
Yes, I appreciate that. And there's another message for you in the chat window from Janet. Okay.
Yeah, what made me want to do a book focusing on this topic? Yeah, as I sort of hinted at the beginning, I really got interested in these questions classes in college on slavery in the American South. And in that class, I wrote a paper about childhood, actually. And it just seemed like a really powerful lens through which to look at history, think about children. And as I continued to be excited about history and to read history books, I thought again and again that children are really left out. Most books that you read about the past, young people's experiences are not part of it. And as I said, almost 50% of the population were children or young adults at the start of the Civil War. So I just think, if you think about percentages of books, certainly not 50% of the books about the Civil War are written about children. So I just want to make a little bit of a dent there. There is a lot of good work, especially more and more, but it's certainly not reflective of the size of the population.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute the lines again. I had muted them periodically just to be able to keep some of the background noise down.
Yep.
So if you have another question, you may need to be able to unmute yourself locally, but I have unmuted everybody here. So that if you have a question for Dr. Davidson directly, you're welcome to pose that as well. If we get too much background distraction, I will mute those again. Trying to keep up with those.
I just got a private message that reminded me that Henry Huntington and Arabella Huntington are both Civil War children. So I just feel like I should mention them to thank them for growing up as they did and establishing the institution that provided my nice year out here in California.
So do we have any other questions here? Janet, do you have anything else that you'd like to be able to say? I just want to make sure that, we're giving people an opportunity, but make sure that we don't keep this all night as well for people if they have other things going on.
I did want to say first and foremost, thank you to you, Dave Richardson, for making this whole evening possible. Dave came to us with the offer to host this virtual meeting. And certainly it isn't something that we had thought of ourselves, and his offer to take care of all the technical aspects of it really made this a good opportunity for us. And I see that a lot of other groups have gotten on the bandwagon. I know that certain people from other Civil War roundtables are actually listening in on this call tonight to see if this is a good format for their own Civil War roundtables. So I want to thank you again for making it possible, Dave. It's really a great way for people to interact during this time. And I think it may be something that we can think about for future meetings, even after we get back to meeting in person. Dr. Davidson, I want to thank you specifically for taking the time to go on this little journey with us, because it's not something we've done, and it sounds like you haven't done it either.
Yeah,
we do have another message in the chat window there, Dr. Davidson.
Yep. So the question was, do you include the Huntington's childhood in the book? I'm planning to, yeah. They don't talk a lot about their experience of growing up during the war, so I haven't figured out exactly how to frame that, but I think that the sort of collecting impulse, their desire to create a collection of Civil War history is really interesting, and I think it's potentially reflective of the influence of the war on their lives, even if they didn't write about it. So the feeling that they had that they were trying to process this difficult and important childhood, and that led to collecting. I think that was true for them, and it was also it was true for other people in this generation. For example, Luis Emilio, who serves as an officer in the Massachusetts 54th, and he becomes sort of an unofficial archivist for the memory of that regiment.
Couldn't find it.
Dr. Davidson, didn't Henry Huntington, one of his first or early acquisitions, was it a Lincoln collection?
Yeah, he was a huge Lincoln collector. I don't remember which specific thing that he collected first, but I do know that was one of his main early interests, was collecting Lincoln materials. And yeah, again, a lot of the prominent figures in this generation, they measure themselves by Lincoln. So Teddy Roosevelt writes about Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson writes about Lincoln, Booker T. Washington writes about Lincoln, and Lincoln is a shadow that looms over everyone who was a child during the Civil War. And of course, Lincoln's experience of the war is shaped by the death of his own child. So, Lincoln and childhood is a very interesting topic in and of itself.
Dr. Davidson, you mentioned Theodore Roosevelt there, and obviously there are some great images and recollections about him witnessing the Lincoln funeral and that type of thing. Yeah. Have you found any source material or stories relating his personal experiences, rather than, since he's a historical figure that we know that was a child at the time, that maybe have shaped him versus the ones where they didn't go on to such prominence as President Roosevelt?
Well, the thing that he talks about is sort of feeling like he missed out, actually, that he was too young to fight, and that he doesn't have that experience. And you can kind of interpret the rest of his life as making up for that he needs to assert his masculinity by fighting in wars, by hunting, by exercising. And I think my interpretation is that experience of just having missed out and serving in the war really shapes who he is as a person, and by default, who he is as a president.
I'm not sure if I'd say that he missed out. He was only like 3 or 4 years old at the end of the war.
Well, but he's still, but his interpretation is that he missed out.
Well, if we don't have any more questions from anybody, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to attend our maiden voyage on the internet of having our meetings this way. I want to thank again both our speaker, Ben Davidson, and Dave Richardson for making it all happen, and to let you know that we will be keeping in touch with you for the details of our May meeting, whether or not we will be meeting virtually or in person, if we're able to use the library. But we'll keep in touch, so watch your email for that notification. And Nick, did you have anything more you wanted to add?
Nick, you're on mute. You need to unmute.
It is my understanding that city facilities will not be available for public meetings through the end of May. So
Okay.
we will not be able to use the library for anything in May, it looks like.
So maybe we should set plans for another virtual meeting in May if we can, and we'll go from there and keep everybody informed.
Yes.
Dr. Davidson, I'm Roy Atherton. My wife didn't put the picture on because she didn't have her makeup on. So anyway, that's her excuse.
Yeah.
I have a question. I've been doing really extensive research on my wife's family.
Mm-hmm.
And she has relatives that were involved in the Civil War as Confederates. But I'm curious, have you done any research on the Choctaws? Because she is Choctaw, and their involvement in the Civil War. They were primarily Confederate, but then again, they weren't. And my understanding is that I have a whole book on the Choctaw Nation that does go all the way back to that period, and even before that period. And my curiosity is, have you found any children that grew out of the Civil War who have been able to talk about their experiences? Interesting question.
Native American children, you mean, or?
You bet, yeah, you bet. Because it's both in her lineage, both her Cherokee and her Choctaw were involved in that.
I have started to research that more. I haven't found anything about the Choctaw specifically, but I have been writing a little bit about a man named Kuana Parker, who was a leader of the Comanche.
Yeah.
And so I've been exploring that history a bit more. So Parker really sees the war from the West. And then after the war, he starts to see soldiers, a lot of them veterans of the war, coming west and trying to take Native American land. So I'm exploring that history as aftermath of the Civil War. But thank you for bringing that up. I haven't looked at the Choctaw history too much, and I would like to learn more about that.
Well, the names of the families that came through that, in fact, there was the McLeans for one, the Moores for another, Choctaw, and there were also their lineage goes way back to both Scotland and Ireland, and they intermarried through Louisiana, Alabama, and so forth. But they were Choctaw intermarriages that went on. And some of their relatives, I suspect, were actually serving in the Confederate. But then again, I don't know yet.
Right. Well, there were Native American tribes on both sides of the war. And there were tribes who held slaves and tribes who fought fiercely to end slavery. Native American history ties into the complexities of Civil War history in fascinating ways.
I raise this issue because her mother wrote an entire genealogical study on the Choctaws and the Cherokees, and their involvement in and during the Civil War, not necessarily directly as soldiers for either side, but it was very interesting to read what she had written. And she was born the late 1800s, late 1880s. But her father was, in fact, in the 22nd Alabama Regiment for a short period of time. He was captured and he was delivered up to Illinois, paroled after 6 months after the war had ended. So there is that history that she had written down, and I had verified it on Fold 3 and so many other areas.
Yeah, it's really fun to dig into that stuff.
Oh boy, not kidding. Well, I don't have any other questions. I just came into this really late. I didn't realize that it was starting this. I was out taking care of my roses.
It's a good activity.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, I appreciate what you have done. This is great. And I hope that you participate in another session with us sometime in the near future. And as far as this COVID-19 thing is concerned, I don't know when it's ever going to come to an end necessarily, or more importantly, when the state will finally start releasing some of the meeting places that we have been at.
Right.
Such as, I see Nick is there, so we're talking about Pasadena, but we're also talking about the LA Civil War Roundtable as well, up at the LDS Family Search Center. So.
Right. Yeah, well, it's been fun to be here, and I'll keep an eye out for future meetings.
Okay, great.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'll let the rest of us go and let Dave have a good rest of his evening. Thank you all for joining us, and keep an eye on your email for future notices.
Will do.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davidson.
Hi, Dave.